it's more or less the same. And that means a certain kind of growth, jobless, a kind of growth that further makes our economy more unequal and concentrates wealth in a smaller number of hands. The budget is designed to meet what the IMF wants us to do, not what the people of Pakistan need. It's shocking to me that we don't even have employment and unemployment figures in the economic surveys. This is not a new story, right? I mean, every year it's more or less the same. The IMF tells us to cut spending and to impose austerity measures. And every year, in a sense, the same questions are asked. Well, how is that compatible with growth or in this case, even spending on development, which of course has also been slashed? And the answer is, well, that's not possible. Both of these things are not compatible. And this is now a story that runs into sometimes even into the decades, not just in Pakistan, but many other countries that are stuck or in a sense, forced to do business with the IMF. So I think when you have austerity and you're asked to cut expenditures, and then even more, when all of the burden of austerity is pushed onto the working class and the poor, no matter what you say or you claim, I think then growth and development just become catchphrases for, further, in a sense, economic hardship for the mass of the population. I think that, the problem is that, there's a deep structural set of weaknesses, right? So for instance, in the last, again, maybe 12 years or so, like what you've seen is that growth is driven by speculative investments, sectors that are run on speculative investments like real estate. We don't have sort of a real meaningful industrial policy, right? An industrial policy where you're not just relying on, sort of low value added sectors that we've relied on for 30 years, like textiles or rice or ghee, but you're also moving towards something that not only allows you to move up the economic food chain globally, but also generate, meaningful employment for the mass of the population. So honestly, I don't see any sector really sort of meeting all of these imperatives, or the real imperatives that I consider when you come up with some kind of economic policy. And so really it's going to be more of the same, more of the speculative investments. So yes, there is of course going to be private investment, as there has been and there will continue to be, but in the kinds of sectors which I don't think have any meaningful multiplier effects in terms of sort of, again, meeting the needs of the mass of the Pakistan's working people. Clear, there is no real change, despite all the rhetoric. I mean, it's more or less the same. We're still drawing on indirect sort of taxes for most of our revenues. We still rely on the money that working class Pakistanis send back home through remittances. We have no asset or meaningful redistribution policies which talk about inequality, in which whether it's land or whether it's other assets. We're still undertaxing, as I said, speculative sectors like real estate. So there isn't anything that's changing. It's more or less the same, and that means a certain kind of growth, jobless, a kind of growth that further makes our economy more unequal and concentrates wealth in a smaller number of hands, and a lot of sort of hidden subsidies to can be state institutions, and it can be big players, some in industry, some in sectors like real estate and construction, again, which ultimately contribute to more and more inequality. Remarkably silent on, the government's own admission in the economic survey that agriculture is in deep crisis. Upwards of 40% of our labor force is employed in agriculture. We've slashed food support prices. We have no meaningful, we call subsidies all elite subsidies, where in fact a food support price is very much a subsidy that targets the poor. And then, as you say, there's little or no spending on other sort of public services like education, like health. So everything has essentially been left to the private sector, whether in agriculture it's middlemen or agribusiness firms, or in health and education, private schools and private universities, even public schools and universities, the quality of education, the price, the costs of education, all of it is unaddressed. And that's because, again, as I said at the outset, the budget is designed to meet what the IMF wants us to do, not what the people of Pakistan need. The problem is taking more and more loans is essentially because we are not able to survive without them. And I think that compels us to think more about what are the underlying causes of why we continue taking more and more loans to pay off old ones. And I think that's a well-known fact. We don't earn as much as we spend, and we have a lot of unproductive expenditures. So we have debt being one of them, but also defense and government overheads, a lot of which is not actually that those expenditures are not actually being, in a sense, targeted in ways that serve the population. They're simply just overheads, costs, or for instance, in the case of defense, non-combat expenditures. So when you have a perennial crisis of spending more than you're earning, then you're going to continue taking more loans. And that, of course, also explains why the creditors, the people who give you the loans, like the IMF, for instance, will continue imposing conditionalities, because their interest is that you generate as much fiscal space that you can pay back more loans. They're not interested in resolving the underlying crisis, and that's up to us to be able to do. And of course, our ruling class has never really been interested in doing so. I don't think that we have a very sustainable debt repayment scheme at the moment. All we're doing is rolling over debt, taking debt from commercial banks to pay back multilaterals and bilaterals. And we're now owing up to about $25 billion a year, and that's still barely covering interest payments. So I don't think there's any viable plan. I think just a little bit of fudging of the numbers is making it appear like somehow this time, the balance of payments is better. We have a primary surplus. But the truth is that the underlying fundamentals have not changed. There's very much in the way of favorable terms. I think, most of the debt that we get from multilaterals, for instance, is on the surface is relatively, low interest rates over the long run. But that accumulates over time, right? And so, as I said, now we're just taking more and more money just to pay back our earlier interest payments. And so I don't think that we're ultimately, I don't think there's any kind of favorable terms that are favorable enough for us to extricate ourselves from the trap. There's a fundamental debt trap, which is basically what the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, called, form of neocolonialism. And I think that, rather than think about, well, how can we improve sort of a little bit here and there so as to get favorable terms, I think that we need to think more structurally about asset redistribution, about cutting unproductive expenditures, about taxing the elite, about dealing with land grabs and mineral grabs and the kinds of sort of what substitutes for meaningful industrial or economic policy in this country, and for sort of meeting the needs of the vast majority of our population, a significant chunk of which is in agriculture, which is in a state of utter distress. I think that's what we need to be thinking about, rather than sort of thinking, oh, how can we get more favorable terms? And whatever favorable terms we get, they will never be favorable enough. The tax sort of scheme or tax sort of revenue system burdens mostly the poor, rather than the middle and upper middle classes, salaried classes, because they're filers, because they get taxed at source, are the ones compelled to pay when large numbers of people are not within the tax net. But it's also worth bearing in mind that large numbers of working people live and work in the informal economy, right, which is unaccounted for in general, including in terms of taxation. And the big wigs in those sectors, the big sort of traders, the big wholesalers, the state institutions that at border crossings are manipulating flows of goods and services. I mean, those are the ones that we should be thinking about, how do we get them into the tax net? As far as, carbon tax or pension, I mean, pension, I think, is a huge crisis, right? Like, we're saying that we don't have money to pay pensions, but pension matters to small, let's say, government employees who, that's their only source of security after retirement. And I think slashing them, while also, mind you, increasing the remuneration that we're giving to the civil and military elite, and sort of guaranteeing their pensions. Again, these are all sort of half-baked measures which only really tell us that the high and mighty, the ruling class, is willing to push all of the burden onto everyone other than themselves. And so I don't think, then there's other issues like the fact that we're not creating incentives for EVs or for solar. And we have this huge, problem with circular debt in the power sector. I mean, there's a number of structural problems. So I don't think that we're really addressing, again, we're going to the source. We're just sort of looking at surface phenomena. And then, as you say, maybe putting more and more burden on those who already are carrying a significant amount of the burden, rather than shifting that burden to those who should be carrying it, which is our ruling class. Policies have been backfiring for the best part of 2.5, 3 decades. All since we've been basically, begging to get more and more money from the IMF, and then the IMF then levies a series of conditionalities, and then we meet those conditionalities by doing exactly that, by putting the burden on the working and middle classes, and completely exempting the elite from sort of carrying their share. So I think that there's a perpetual backfire, and informality, the size of the informal economy. We don't even know anything about it. We don't even know. It's shocking to me that we don't even have employment and unemployment figures in the economic survey. So it's almost like we're pretending like that there's this huge black box that doesn't really exist, and just sort of criminalizing it and saying, oh, they don't pay tax. But really, what we should be doing is acknowledging it by thinking about it, by sort of institutionalizing it, and then forcing those who, even in the informal and the formal economy, the elite operates across this divide, making them the targets of our especially revenue policy, and then also adopting, spending on public services and an industrial policy that can create jobs. I mean, the rot is so deep that I think that, again, it's important to go beyond just the cosmetics and think about deeper long-term changes, which admittedly won't happen in one year or one day, but certainly are things that we need to be talking about, rather than glossing over and just thinking, about what we can do to maybe just take the next step forward.